All right, thanks. Okay, thank you. Okay, well, I'd like to start our conversation today by asking each of you to try and recall one customer service interaction that was quite upsetting for you. And then, if you can try and remember what it was, what was the reason that you got so worked up? Was it because you felt that the other person wasn't listening to you, that he just couldn't hear what you were saying? You would say one thing, and then you get a reply, which seemed to not have anything to do with what you said. And so you try and explain further, and you get the same reply. Or was it because you felt you didn't have a voice, you didn't have a say, no choice was given to you? You were told, that's the system, that's the policy, that's the rule, and we can't do anything about it. Or was it because you felt you were being treated unfairly? So I think for those of you who had a story in your mind, each of your stories would have been different. But the reason they stood out in your memory is because each of you would have felt, in one way, shape, or form, a feeling of rejection. Because social rejection is social pain. So now that we have technology, and we're talking about technology, fMRI, I'm sure you're familiar, you've heard of MRI. So it has now allowed us to actually look into the brain and see what's happening as we're feeling, as we're thinking. And one of the more significant discoveries that has emerged in the field of neuroscience, social neuroscience to be exact, is that social pain is seen and treated by the brain equally, if not more intensely, than physical pain. So if you see, social pain and physical pain share the same brain circuitry. Think about it. Imagine Tylenol. Tylenol removes all the effects and the feelings of social pain. Because if the brain doesn't see much difference between social pain and physical pain, then it would react in much the same way. And I'm not asking you to try it, but if you take Tylenol, right, think of it, it's the same killer that you take, painkiller that you take for your headache, you can also take for your heartache. So, there's a warning that comes with that. Okay. And so let's take a look at what happens in the brain when you feel pain, social or physical. Okay, so the brain's main organizing principle is to minimize danger and maximize reward. So constantly your brain is taking in everything in your environment, what you see, what you hear, what you taste, even what you smell. And it's gonna think, is this person, is this situation, is this place gonna bring me harm? Or is this gonna bring me good? Is it gonna help me? And when your brain senses harm, senses danger, that portion, the purple portion called the amygdala, it's gonna sound an alarm. And it's gonna alert the limbic system, which is the area of the brain that's enclosed by that blue border. So the hippocampus, the amygdala, these are all part of the limbic system. That limbic system is gonna be in a state of alert. It's known as the threat state. Okay, so the limbic system, let's look at that first. The limbic system is the seat of your emotions. This is the part of your brain that processes your emotions. It's the more primitive part of our brain, and it's what we share in common with animals. Animals' brains, they have this. And it's primitive because like I said, for the limbic system, there are only two choices ever, threat or reward. And when you're in a threat state, two choices, fight or flight. So your fight or flight reflex, that sits and that's triggered by the limbic system. So what happens when your limbic system is in a threat state? So I'm going to talk about three things that happen in the brain whenever your limbic system is in a threat state. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is people often refer to as the amygdala hijack. So do you ever notice, okay, when you're in a heated argument, you're really upset, right? You're not talking or speaking rationally. You're trying to think of this good comeback. But all you can come up with is, basta. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. That's the amygdala hijack. What happened there is that your prefrontal cortex, which is that orange section of your brain, effectively shuts down when your limbic system is in a threat state. So what does that mean for us? What's the prefrontal cortex? So the prefrontal cortex is actually what makes us different from animals. It's our rational thinking, our analytical thinking, critical thinking. It's what you hire for and what you were arguably hired for. Problem solving. It actually houses our executive functions, our ability to inhibit, our ability to delay gratification. That's all done in the prefrontal cortex. So you can imagine, it's our conscious thought, it's our working memory. And so, it needs the most and uses up the most amount of energy. But when the amygdala sounds the alarm, the amygdala hijacks all of the energy sources. All of the oxygen that comes to the brain is just allocated for the limbic system, because our limbic system is there to protect us. And that's what happens when you're in a threat state. You're not thinking rationally because your prefrontal cortex is not functioning. The oxygen is not coming to it. Interestingly enough, I want to say the prefrontal cortex only matures when we're about 18 years old, and for some, early to mid-20s. So I don't know if any of you, you're familiar with the marshmallow test. Yeah, so that's why they conducted the marshmallow test on kids. It would not have worked on adults because kids, their PFC hasn't matured yet, their prefrontal cortex. And so the ability to delay that gratification, the eating of the marshmallow, is much, much harder for them. So if you're parents and you have kids, please don't be so worried if your kid doesn't know how to share or can't wait his turn. It's just because the PFC hasn't yet matured. So another thing that happens in the brain is that your autopilot switches on. Okay, so the autopilot, that's your basal ganglia. It's found here, so at the base of the brain. That's where you house all your hardwiring. Okay, hardwiring would be your habits. You know, it would be your maps that will tell you how to breathe, how to eat, you know, how to drive. So let's step into that driving. Okay, so what's happening in the brain when you're driving? And by the way, I don't know how to drive, but I know what the brain's doing. So while you're driving, it's your basal ganglia that's telling you to step on the gas, step on the brake, steer the wheel, right? If you think about it, these things you do like it's reflex. It's non-conscious. That's because you've hardwired it after days, months, and years of driving. And that's your basal ganglia. So what's your PFC doing, your prefrontal cortex? What's it doing while you're driving? It's navigating. It's the conscious process. So back in the day, your prefrontal cortex would be looking at the environment, traffic, not traffic, determining which route you're gonna take. Today, your prefrontal cortex is listening to Waze. So that's what's happening. It's a tandem, right? So whenever you do two things at once, think about it. One will be something you do non-consciously, and that's your basal ganglia helping you. The other thing you're doing is something you're doing consciously, and that's your prefrontal cortex. So when the limbic system is in a threat state, right, all the limbic system wants you to do is to punch someone or to run away, fight or flight. Your prefrontal cortex is not functioning properly. And so your basal ganglia is the one that's telling you breathe, walk. So that's what's happening. The third thing that happens, or another thing that happens, is that the brain will release a hormone that's called cortisol. I'm not sure if some of you have heard it. What does cortisol do? Okay, two things. One, it heightens your attention. Again, you're in a threat state, so you need to be alert. But the other thing that cortisol does, it intensifies the feeling. You know, so that prickly feeling, you start to sweat, your heart is racing, your blood is pumping, your blood pressure shoots up. That's because of cortisol. And cortisol does it for a reason. It wants you to remember that pain. It wants you to embed it in your memory. Right? But why? Why does our brain want us to remember such painful experiences? It's because the brain's main goal is for us to survive. And for us to survive, we have to avoid those painful experiences. And the way the brain does that is it makes you remember it. So if you've heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, That's what cortisol does. You know, you're in an accident, a car accident. It's really bad. You survive it. 10 years later, you find yourself back in that same place where you had that accident, and you feel the same feeling, as if it was the day you had that accident. That's cortisol, and that's your brain telling you, stay away. Danger, danger. The thing about cortisol, right? So it's for survival, right? Your brain will keep releasing it into your bloodstream. It's a hormone. It stays in your bloodstream. And the only time your brain will stop is when it senses a physical release of fight or flight mode. So actually your brain really wants you to punch someone, punch something, run in place. Run away, right? That's what it wants you to do. But now in a customer service interaction, how can you do that? How can you tell the person, once you sense, okay, they're in a threat state. It's so strange to tell them, can you start running in place? Just to release the cortisol. It's hard, right? So how do you do it? How do you disarm a threat state in a customer service interaction, in any interaction? And the answer I'm going to propose to you today is empathy. So in psychology, cognitive empathy is the drive to identify another person's thoughts and feelings. It's recognizing another's mental state. And for me, it's recognizing that there's a mental state other than yourself, your own. Because that's our natural tendency. That's what the brain does. If you remember the prefrontal cortex, what it does is it takes in new information. It's going to reconcile that with your existing maps. What are your existing maps? It's connections you've built throughout your life. So your maps will be different from mine, will be different from the person next to you. So right now, you're receiving this new information. Your PFC is now trying to reconcile that with an existing map to form a new connection. So each of you would form a different connection. We'd form as many connections in this room as there are a number of people. And so, that's your natural tendency. And so it's so hard. It's a conscious process to be empathic. It's not easy because you have to consciously forget your own thinking and think of someone else's. So what does empathy look like? 2 weeks ago, I started really feeling nervous about today's talk. And so maybe it started every 2 days, I'd tell my husband, I'm really, really nervous. And very genuinely, I would sense his genuine, the sincerity in his statement. He'd say, you're gonna be amazing. And it would annoy me because I was nervous. I just wanted him to tell me I was nervous. That yes, you're nervous. So that exchange would continue. It became more frequent. I'd tell him every day, more than once a day, I'm nervous, until 3 days ago when we were seated at breakfast. So that night, I spent the whole night finishing the presentation. I wasn't happy. This is the second version. So you can imagine, right? 3 days away from the talk, I'm not prepared. I'm not happy with what I've come up with. I've been in this prolonged state of threat, so now I'm in a state of panic. And so the next morning, I tell my husband, I'm really, really nervous, I'm not prepared. And he says, you're gonna be amazing. And I just snapped. I started to cry. And I raised my voice and I told him, you know what, on Friday, I'm gonna be talking about empathy. And do you know, your reaction, that is what empathy is not. And to be fair to my husband, he stayed calm. And he said, what do you want me to say? And I said, I wish you would just say, that must be so hard for you. Because social pain is real pain. But because we don't see it, it becomes less real for others. And eventually, it becomes less real for us. We start thinking, maybe they're right. Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe I shouldn't be feeling this way. And then you start to dismiss it. You brush it aside. And you find ways to cope with it on your own because nobody else is feeling what you're feeling. Right? So if you think again of the brain, your PFC is telling you it's rational. What are you nervous about? There's nothing to be afraid of. It's trying to dismiss the feeling. But your limbic system cries out, I don't care what you say. You can say it a bazillion times. I'm feeling this. I'm in a threat state. And one thing about the PFC and limbic system, when they're in disagreement, the limbic system always wins. The limbic system shuts down the PFC. And so, whenever my husband would tell me, "You're gonna be amazing," all I could hear him saying was, "Why are you nervous?" He was telling me the very thing I'd been trying to convince myself for weeks on end to believe. But no matter how much I tried to dismiss it, the feeling wouldn't go away. And so, if one day you find you can't cope with it on your own, and you have to share it with someone, because you want that person to tell you, "You know what? I know you've been trying to dismiss it. It's hard because it's real. What you're feeling is real." My husband couldn't recognize my feeling. He couldn't see it. And so every time he would say that, I felt more isolated and more alone. This kind of empathy that I'm talking about really is best described by one of my favorites. Her name, if you've heard of her, is Brené Brown. She's a researcher, storyteller, and this is how she talks about empathy. It's simply listening, holding space, withholding judgment, emotionally connecting, and communicating that incredibly healing message of "you're not alone." So we're talking about empathy and customer service. I will talk about United Airlines. But we'll hold off on talking about that infamous incident, which I'm sure you've all heard, where a passenger was forcibly removed from the plane. I'm actually going to start with an incident that happened within a few months before. So it was earlier, just a few months. And it involved two Filipinos. So you have a mother and daughter. The mother is 94 years old. They both live in Australia. And actually, they're going to attend a family reunion in the States. The mom, of course, 94 years old, she has severe arthritis and other disabilities. But then, when her doctor gave her the go-ahead to travel, all of her family members chipped in to buy her a business class ticket because they wanted her to be comfortable, which she was on the way to the States. But on the way back on the flight, when they boarded, her daughter escorted her to the business class cabin because the daughter was going to fly economy. And then she'd asked the flight attendant, she said, she asked for permission. "I'd like to be able to go in and out of the business class cabin throughout the flight because I'd like to be able to check in on my mom. She needs my help walking to the lavatory. During mealtime, she can only eat fruit, bread, and butter, and she needs help buttering the roll." So she asked for permission, and this is her version. She said the flight attendant, her first and immediate reply was to say, "People pay to be in business class." And then she walked away, and minutes later, she came back with another flight attendant. And they both told her and her mother that they could not accommodate her request, and that they could only offer them two options. The first option is for the mother to move to economy, to sit with her so she can take care of her mother. The second is for both of them to deplane and rebook the ticket and buy herself a business class ticket so she could fly business and take care of her mother. And she was only given about 5 minutes to decide because they said the flight was going to take off. So she didn't choose either of the options. So she asked the flight attendant, would you take care of my mother instead? Just walk her to the lavatory and then butter her roll. And again, her version was that the flight attendant just turned and walked away. So I'd like to ask you, just a show of hands, who among you find that you can empathize more, and we'll call it sides, with the flight attendant? Or I can't really see. Okay. And who among you can empathize more with the mother and daughter? Okay. All right. So I think there are more who empathize more with the mother and daughter, and I was hoping for that because what I really want to point out is that our empathy is influenced by I'll talk about three social factors that influence our empathy. And the first is whether we see a person as part of our in-group or out-group. That can influence our empathy. And I'd say at the very basic level, a number of us can empathize with a mother and daughter because we're all Filipinos, just at that very basic level. But also maybe because you have a mother that's disabled, that's sick, or another family member, and you know how difficult it is to take care of them, let alone on a flight. But also, what I want to say is, you probably didn't know about this story because it just didn't go viral. I could only find 3 articles on it. And one article explained that there are also a number of people who spoke for the flight attendants. So for them, their in-group were the flight attendants and they said they wanted to protect the rights of business class passengers. And arguably, this incident happened because the flight attendants may not have seen the mother and daughter as part of their in-group, which is why they didn't empathize with them. And studies have shown this. So they've taken couples inside a laboratory. So one of them would be placed inside an fMRI and the other one outside. And they were told throughout the test that they would be given an electric shock, one at a time. And 3 seconds before the electric shock is administered, they were going to be told who was be given the electric shock. So for that person who was in the fMRI, they looked at the brain. When the person received an electric shock, they saw the reaction. Now, when that person found out that their partner was going to receive an electric shock, their brain reacted in the same way. So our brain is wired to be empathic, but in this sense, and it's called affective empathy. Affective empathy is feeling another person's feelings. And that, I would say, is more automatic, less conscious. They conducted a similar test, different conditions, this time just one volunteer. And that volunteer was grouped with 2 others, right? 2 of them both were actors, but the volunteer didn't know that. And the 3 of them were asked to play a game. It's called the money game. One actor was asked to play fairly, another actor to play unfairly. So maybe he just kept getting the money and not sharing. And then after this game, they put the volunteer inside an fMRI. And the same thing with the electric shocks. And what they found was, when the person who played fair was going to get the electric shock, the volunteer empathized with them. So the same brain reaction. But when the person who played unfairly was going to get the electric shock, for women, they empathized with that person. But for men, no, no empathy. So again, so the second social factor, fairness. Whether a person is perceived to be fair or unfair, that can influence the way you feel for them, empathize with them or not. And yes, women are more empathic than men. They've seen this. And if you think about it, think of evolution. Women, we are the primary caregivers. We're the mothers. And for our babies, our children to survive, we have to be able to empathize with them. We have to know what they're thinking and feeling. And that's why we have high empathy, or more empathy relative to men. The men, they're supposed to protect the family, hunters, right? So sometimes they might have to be aggressive. They might have to inflict harm on another thing. And so they have to be able to bring down and lower their empathy. So then comes the next United Airlines story, which is what you're all familiar with. And that's where the doctor was forcibly removed from the plane. And I'm not going to talk about the details. What I want us to ponder on today is why the flight attendants didn't empathize with the passenger. Even if he was bleeding and he was clearly in physical pain. And what I'd like to say is that it's because that's what they were trained to do. Right? You can look at it in this angle. They may have been in a threat state. So their autopilot was switched on. And what's autopilot but our systems, our standard procedures, our rules, our policies. And that's what they followed. But also, it's been found that obedience to authority can actually lead to low empathy. But what does that mean for us? Well, today, our authority, especially in these situations, would be the system. What we've been trained to do, the standard procedures, the rules, the guidelines, the policies. That's what our authority is today. So, right, interactions, they're spontaneous, right? But what we've now done is to translate these spontaneous interactions into step-by-step if-then processes. And in so doing, we would have naturally stripped off the elements which involve emotions, feelings, the bits that involve applying common sense, applying our values. And then we'll train our people to perform these processes, to run these processes. And we equip them with skills. We train them on analytical thinking, critical thinking, all to do with the PFC, very little to do with managing interactions, the threat state. And then we'll cap it off with rewards. Rewards that recognize people who abide by the rules and stick to the processes, streamline the process. But what of inculcating values? I'd ask, how many in your company know your company's values? Know your company's vision and mission? And of those, how many believe and strive to achieve the vision and mission and live the values? Today, the values are the words that you see on the walls if you bother to read them. And when it comes to these situations which involve emotions, feelings, social rejection, social pain, this is the time to go off script. This is the time to empathize, to take your own discretion and be guided by your values, not the process. And I'm not suggesting we get rid of the system. We don't develop procedures and processes and rules and policies. What I'm saying is that there is a piece missing. And that missing piece is the off switch on the autopilot. Because we can't let our processes dictate our thinking all the time, not when it comes to people. And I'd argue everything happens with people. So when I first issued a check that bounced years ago, the first thought in my mind was, why didn't the tellers or the branch call me to tell me I needed funds? Or why didn't they even tell me my check bounced? I just saw a charge on my account, and actually I had an account in the same bank which had the funds. And maybe all of you are thinking, duh, why would they? Who are you? But let me explain. It's because when I was growing up, the tellers would call my mom. They'd tell her, hey, you issued a check, you don't have enough funds. Can you come to the bank to make a deposit before cutoff so your check will clear? And that's what I thought customer service was. That's what customer service was for me growing up. So how did it get from these bank tellers to the flight attendants? We used to depend on each other for survival. Now it's what's in it for me and the bottom line number. These bank tellers, secretaries, executive assistants, they were all part of our Christmas lists when I was growing up, and there were many of them. Now the few that we speak with, we may not necessarily know their names. My husband grew up in Australia, and in the area he grew up in, there used to be 4 bank branches. And now his mom's saying there's none. Let's say shopping, one of my favorite childhood memories was, and this is gonna date me, but it's okay, was buying shoes in SM. Okay, so you'd go to SM, and when you finally pick a pair of shoes, a salesperson would grab a microphone. There would be several microphones that are dangling from the ceiling. I'm glad I'm not the only old person here. So there would be microphones dangling from the ceiling. They would grab it and they'd call out the shoe style number, your size, and the color. And seriously, like magic, there's gonna be this hand that reaches out from the ceiling with your shoebox. You know, it was as if your shoe came down from heaven, and I loved it. It was so magical for me. But now I shop for shoes online. You know, it's very easy to lose sight of the human value behind each and every one of our transactions, and lose sight of the human being on the other side of it. We now live in an economy of having instead of being, which is why we need empathy. Empathy is a being, it's not a doing. It's forgetting oneself for the sole purpose of welcoming otherness. So they say we can go through our whole lives and not know who we are until we see the world through the eyes of others. Empathy is a choice, and I wish that each and every one of you here will choose empathy as often as possible. Because, and this has been my personal experience, in welcoming otherness, you will find the path to who you are and who you're supposed to be. A poet once said, "Away beyond the world of right and wrongdoing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." Thank you.